Thank you, Gene. I know I have experienced this quite a few times in my life. You probably have as well, and you probably find them to be unpleasant experiences. And that is, something is going on, and you really, really, really want to, and you really need to laugh, but the environment is such that it's not conducive or appropriate to be able to laugh. You've experienced those occasions. For me, when I was a teenager, consistently that seemed to happen whenever our church was observing communion. Not a good time to laugh. Just to paint a picture for you of what that was like. I remember one particular incident. It was on a Sunday night. We were having the Lord's Supper. All of our youth were kind of seated together near the front, and so I'm there with my friends, and the pastor is doing a message as a setup for us observing the Lord's Supper, and he's appealing to passages like you find in 1 Corinthians, where Paul was addressing a group of believers and to a church that had essentially made the observance of the Lord's Supper a free-for-all, and he's communicating to them, God takes this whole thing seriously. And he says, for this reason, some among you are sick and some even sleep. So Paul's implication is clear. God takes this so seriously that there were some in judgment that he had caused to be physically ill, and some that he had decided, I'm just going to go ahead and bring them on to heaven. They have died. So with that type of seriousness and with those types of passages, then it's time for us to actually observe communion. So that the pastor comes down, and you've seen this 1,000 times before, and so he begins to share some passages of Scripture appealing to that final night of Jesus' earthly life and ministry. Then it's time for the deacons to come and get the trays containing those bread wafers, those delicious, can't get enough of wafers, right? And so that the deacons are passing those, and so it takes a little bit for them to get these dispensed throughout the congregation. It's absolutely quiet except for a little bit of soft piano music playing in the background. And once all the bread has been passed, the pastor says a few more words, and then we all eat the bread at the same time. After that, it's time for the passing of the cup. The pastor says some more instructive words. The deacons begin to pass the trays containing these little cups of juice. Now, our church at that point used these little disposable plastic communion cups. So many churches use them. Anyway, they're passing those. That they come by me. I take one from the tray. I'm holding it. Two people down, my friend Jeff also picks one, and he's holding it in his hand, kind of like that. And so, as he is holding the cup, it's very quiet, just piano music in the background. Nobody's saying anything. Nobody's. It's just very quiet and reverent. And all of a sudden, I hear, and I look over, and Jeff has unintentionally squeezed his communion cup hard enough that he's cracked it, and juice is slowly leaking out into his hand. And I don't know if outside that environment it would have been funny, but at that point, at that time, it was the funniest thing I'd ever seen. And I wanted to laugh so badly. I wanted to say something so badly, but I just couldn't. And so all I did was turn bright, beet red-faced, and essentially had a stroke. But after the service was over, man, it was like the pressure cooker had been removed, and it felt so good to finally get that out, to be able to talk about that, and to actually be able to laugh. You have probably had those experiences, multiplied occasions in your life thus far, and you're probably still going to have them. It's interesting that I believe very much there's a character from the Bible, a man that we have been looking at over the past couple of weeks that knows exactly what that feels like. And of course, that man is Zacharias. And over these past couple of weeks, we have talked about, and you recall how we've noted how he and his wife Elizabeth were two that God used to prepare for Christmas, for the coming of Jesus into the world. And over these past few weeks, we've been going through a series of messages that I've called Deck the Halls, how God prepared for Christmas. And one of the ways in which God prepared for the coming of Jesus was to send to Zacharias and Elizabeth this miracle, this baby that would become John the Baptist, who would lay the foundation for, pave the way for the coming Messiah. And you recall, we briefly noted this last week, that throughout the course of Elizabeth's pregnancy, God had caused Zacharias to be mute. Once this son is finally born, God restores to Zacharias the ability to speak. And finally, he is able to get it out. He had felt like me wanting to laugh so hard during communion. Finally, he's got some things that he wants to say, some things I think that are pretty instructive for us as followers of Christ. But what exactly did he say? Look with me in your Bibles today to Luke chapter 1. Luke chapter 1, this takes us immediately up to the verses describing the actual birth of Jesus. We're going to be looking at a fairly large section of Scripture, so what I want you to do is just to keep your Bibles open and just kind of hang with me as we walk through this passage this morning. Luke chapter 1, the focus of what we'll look at begins in verse 57, but let me set the stage for you. In the opening chapter of Luke's gospel, we're introduced to this man named Zacharias. And among the things that we are told about them is that, first of all, Zacharias is a priest. He's married to a woman named Elizabeth. They don't have any children because she was barren. In addition, we're told that they are in the winter years of life. They are well advanced in years. They are old. And you recall that while Zacharias was serving as a priest in the temple, God sends the angel Gabriel to have a conversation with Zacharias. And he explains to Zacharias that God has decided to use he and his wife to do something significant. That he wants to perform a miracle where she is able to conceive and she'll give birth to a son, one that will pave the way for and be the forerunner for the coming Messiah. And you remember that in response to that, Zacharias, after hearing what the angel says, in verse 18, he says, "How will I know that this is going to happen?" Essentially what he's saying is, how do I know that God is actually in this? Is there some sort of sign that you can give me? And Gabriel says, "Sign? You want a sign? Fine. You won't be able to speak throughout the course of your wife's pregnancy until this son is born." And so at that point, the clock begins to tick as 9 long months pass, and Zacharias can't say a word. He can open his mouth, he might be able to cough, but he can't actually say anything. And as he is experiencing day in and day out, month in and month out of absolute silence and an inability to speak, he is hearing from Elizabeth and watching Elizabeth as she's going through this. And you've got to think that at some point early on, he was able to hear his wife say, Zacharias, I can't believe this. I actually am pregnant. I really can't believe that God has chosen to do this for us. I really am going to have a baby. Beyond that, he was able to watch as early on she began to have a little bump, and then in time that grew to the point where she is descriptive of Mary in Luke 2, she is great with child. And throughout this 9-month process, what is going on is that he is able to see tangible evidence and tangible proof of the fact that, yes, God is in fact in this. This is absolutely the activity and the work of God. But apart from writing it down, he had no way to express his feelings, no way to express his thoughts about everything that he was observing. What had initially begun for him as this experience with an angel where Zacharias had doubts and questions, at this point, all the questions, all the doubts, all the uncertainty is gone, and he is certain in his heart God is doing something amazing, tremendously significant in our lives. By the time you get to verse 57, we're told that Elizabeth's full time came and for her to be delivered, and she brought forth a son. So 9 months have passed, she gives birth, this son is born. And in verse 59, we're at that point on the 8th day after this boy's birth. And for him as a male Jew, a couple of things were going to happen. First of all, on the 8th day, he was going to go through the tradition of circumcision. So that was going to happen. But also, he was going to get a name. Now, I don't know if you're aware of this, but Jewish tradition, it was that a child does not get named until the 8th day after birth. And so for the first 7 days, you just say, hey, baby. How you doing, baby? Sorry, that was ridiculous. Anyway, but by the 8th day, the child gets a name. And so family, friends, neighbors, they're gathered around, and they're anxious to see and hear what this child is actually going to be named. And we're told that they ask her in verse 60, they're wanting to know what's he going to be named, and Elizabeth says he's going to be called John. Because initially what they're saying is that, what are you going to name this little boy? I'm guessing probably Zacharias, maybe you'll call him Junior, something like that. And she says, no, we're going to call him John. And they're like, John? That's not a family name. Where'd you come up with that? Why in the world would you want to name this little boy John? That's not at all in your family line. And so then they appeal to this mute father. Zacharias still is not able to speak. And so in verse 62, they made signs to his father. What would he want him to be called? And so in verse 63, he asked for a writing tablet. So they hand him something to write with, and he writes the letters down, John. At this point, two things happen. First of all, the son now has a name. His name is John. And secondly, Zacharias' mouth is opened. He has had restored by God the ability to speak. And so as he is experiencing this, I want this context to kind of settle into your minds. Zacharias had heard months before the words of the angel who explained, listen, God is going to be doing something significant in your life and in the life of Elizabeth. And in response to that, he questions and doubts, is God actually in this or not? And so God responds by making him mute for these 9 months. And during this time, he was able to see day in and day out tangible fruit of the fact, tangible evidence indicating absolutely this is something that God is in. Recognizing not only does he have a front row seat to the activity of God, God has chosen to actively involve him in the work of preparing and paving the way for the Messiah that is to come. And in all that time, Zacharias couldn't say anything. He felt like me on that Sunday night. Jeff's cup broken, and I just wanted to get it out, but I couldn't. For 9 months, he's no doubt wanted to express some things, wanted to communicate some things, but he just could not. Now, I believe that we not only can, but we should seek to be intentional about trying to put ourselves in the shoes of Zacharias. Now, by that, I'm not suggesting whatsoever that God is going to send an angel to have a conversation with you and say, oh yeah, by the way, you're going to have a miracle baby. But I am saying this. I believe that God will, and probably already has, and certainly will in the future, come to you in the form of a thought that he puts on your mind, a burden that he will put on your heart, where he is communicating to you that he wants to do something that involves you. And initially, you'll have to wrestle with whether or not this actually is of God. But when you respond to that burden, when you respond and follow that direction, what will happen is that, like Zacharias, you finally get to the point where you can say with no uncertainty, with no doubt, man, God absolutely is in this. When you get to that point, where does that leave you? What is it that you're able to discover? Well, we see the answer to that in what Zacharias begins to say. And based on what he says, I believe what we come to experience is that once we know that God is actually in something, we discover two realities. And the first is God accomplishes good purposes. When you come to discover God is in this, whatever burden it is that he's put in your heart, whatever direction it is that he's guiding you, when you know that's of him, you come to discover that he is accomplishing good purposes. Starting in verse 68, Zacharias begins to speak. And the first thing that he does is to verbalize the goodness of God, describing how God has visited his people and is in the process of redeeming them. He goes on to describe how God, through the lineage of David, is bringing one into the world that will bring about salvation. And this one that is to come is the fulfillment of God's promises. And the goal of his coming is that we might be saved, and according to verse 74, to grant us that we, being delivered from the hand of our enemies, might serve him without fear in holiness and righteousness all the days of our lives. So he is, through this beautiful language, extolling what it is that God is actually up to. And he is saying, you know what, God is in this. He has been in this. Initially, I didn't see it, but now I recognize it. God is doing something significant. He's let me have a front row seat to this. He's let me be involved in this process. And finally, what I can clearly see is that God is accomplishing altogether good purposes. Now, understand this. He didn't recognize that initially. When the angel first came to him, he didn't see that. He was not aware of this. It took him 9 months to get to this point, to get to this place. Well, I think on a variety of levels that makes sense, doesn't it? Those of you who are parents can attest to the fact that there is absolutely nothing this side of heaven that really compares to the blessing of being a parent. And as a dad of 4 children, I wouldn't trade all the money in the world for it. It is an unparalleled blessing. Now, that being said, I am aware, and you as a parent are aware of the fact that it's not all sugar and spice and everything nice. And though it is absolutely a blessing best described as being heaven sent, there is nothing that you will experience that is more demanding of and draining of your patience, your time, your wallet, your efforts, your energy than being a parent. I mean, it is the most demanding, most grueling work that you will never, ever get paid for. And as wonderful as it is, and as grateful as I am to experience it, I would further add, I'm grateful to be experiencing it now. I don't want to be becoming a dad when I'm old. I don't want to be becoming a father when I'm in the winter years of life. I don't want to be spending my Social Security check buying diapers for anybody other than me. Right? But those of you who are further along and further down the road than me, suppose you're 70, 75 years old and you're in the winter season of life. Suppose God comes to you one day, as he did to Zacharias, and says, hey, you're going to have a baby. Is your first thought going to be, goody, goody, goody? Your teeth will fall out, you'll pick them up, and... You won't do that. You'll wash them off and then put them back in. Anyway. Your first thought is not going to be, oh, goody, goody. You're going to be like, now? At this stage in life? I mean, the sleepless nights, the changing of the diapers, teaching to walk, teaching to write, teaching to count. Man, going through all of that now? You've got to think that there was certainly a part of Zacharias and Elizabeth that thought those same thoughts. And yes, they are grateful and excited that finally they're going to have a child, that God has chosen to use them. There absolutely had to be a part of them that thought, really? We got to do all this now? I believe that news came to Zacharias and Elizabeth initially not only with a measure of shock, but with an awareness that it's going to lead them through a series of experiences that were not going to be entirely pleasant. But Zacharias, over these 9 months, comes to discover that even if God leads you through circumstances that are not entirely pleasant and entirely to your choosing, whatever it is that he leads you through, it is to accomplish, and he came to realize God is accomplishing good purposes. Now, that's instructive for us. Hopefully you remember from last week, one of the things that I noted is this. God is not content for you or for me as a follower of his that we just wander aimlessly through life and that we just kind of meander and go with the flow and just kind of figure stuff out. God has specific plans and purposes for us, ways in which that he wants to work in, with, through me, and in, with, and through you. Specific things that he wants to do involving you. And how he'll communicate that to you sometimes is with a thought that comes to mind or a burden that he puts on your heart. And when that news first comes to you, very easily you can respond with thoughts like this. No, that can't be. Certainly God's not in this, or I hope God's not in this, because that thought, that burden, that's not fun. That's not easy. That's not pleasant. But here's the deal. When you respond to it, and when you begin to follow that lead, what you're able to come to discover in time is that even if He is leading you through things that you may view as unpleasant, finally you'll get to the point when you know this is of Him, that He is absolutely accomplishing good purposes. But understand this, generally you do not see that when it's happening. Generally, you don't see that at the outset. Generally, what happens is that you've got to get perspective, and oftentimes the perspective of hindsight, and you're able to look back and you can see, I was wondering why in the world God was leading me through that. I didn't want Him encouraging me or guiding me to do that, but I went through that, and now looking back, I can see He was accomplishing altogether good purposes. Let me paint a picture for you this way. I was 26 years old when I first started pastoring, and I was fresh out of seminary. In addition, I was single. I was spending all my work hours at church, hospital, funeral home, nursing home with church people. Even away from church, I was spending all of my time with church people because I was single, and it was otherwise I'm just going to go sit at home by myself. And I'm spending all of my time with a group of people among whom there actually is no prospect for me to date. And so I'm single, but I would add to that, quite frankly, I viewed myself, and in looking back at that stage, I would say that I was hopelessly single. And I say that for this reason. I can talk to anybody, I really can. But the thought of talking to a girl in such a way that I'm expressing interest or communicating feelings, that thought scared me to death. And so not only was I single, I viewed myself to be hopelessly single. Well, fast forward a few years, and a friend of mine, David, who's actually spoken here, was studying at Southwestern Seminary in Fort Worth. And I'd taken a little bit of vacation time to go out and to spend a few days with him. I flew out to Fort Worth, and I remember he picked me up on a Thursday night, took me back there to Southwestern's campus where his apartment was. He had some friends that were over, including this girl that also went to Southwestern. And this group of us, we were playing cards and just having a good time that night. And I remember that first night thinking, this girl is really, really funny. And I just enjoyed that time together. Now, over the next few days, she continued to hang out with us in ways where I began to think, I'm actually interested in her. And I got to the point where I thought, you know what? She may be interested in me. Of course. As they say in Latin, duh. Sorry. But, I'm only out there for a few days, and so I've got to get back on a plane and head back home. And as I get back home, there's this part of me, and even flying back, I was thinking, I'd like to have known what might have happened. And so I talked to David and kind of told him where I was, and he said, you know what, let me ask her and see if she'd be interested in you calling her. And so she was, and he gave me her number, and I began to call her. And in the weeks and months that followed, we would talk on a regular basis. Finally, I decided I'm going to go back out to Fort Worth and see if anything may come from this. And in my mind, I'm thinking, how exactly do you work a relationship between Fort Worth, Texas, and Charlotte, North Carolina? But I'm going to go and see if I can figure this out. And to make a long story short, I get back out to Fort Worth, and within the first 24 hours, I knew nothing is going to come from this. Nothing is going to come from this. And so I head back home, and I remember sitting on the airplane, and I wasn't excited at this point. I'm feeling fairly discouraged, a little heartsick. I had my hopes high. I thought this was so promising, and quite frankly, I really felt that God had led me to these circumstances and led me to that point and place. And so why is it I'm on an airplane coming back feeling so lousy? Why is it that I'm going now through these unpleasant feelings and these unpleasant experiences? So I get back home, and a few days later, I am on my computer, and I happen to see this ad on my homepage for this website called Match.com. I thought, you know what, I've got nothing to lose. And to make a long story short, I signed up, and within 3 days I got an email from this girl that turned out to have the name Caroline. Not this one, it was a different one. And anyway, we exchanged emails over a few days, and she gave me her phone number. I called, and we talked a few times on the phone, and finally had our first date on February the 13th of 2004. And we wasted a whole lot of time, and were engaged on April the 11th, and then married on October the 16th of 2004. Now, what's interesting to me is this. Months earlier, I was coming back to Charlotte on an airplane, feeling discouraged, feeling a bit dejected, wondering, God, I thought I had this thing figured out. It seemed to me that these were circumstances that you were in. Why am I feeling these unpleasant feelings? Why am I going through these experiences? Well, I was not able to see it and to recognize it until months later. But finally, I was able to recognize that God was using those unpleasant circumstances to accomplish altogether good purposes. Now, with all of my heart, and I say this with a clear conscience today, I believe that God led me through those experiences and through that encounter in Texas, meeting that girl, to communicate a couple of things to me. First of all, there are good girls out there. Secondly, I can talk to them. And finally, I was ready for and capable of a real and meaningful relationship. In short, what I'm saying to you is that with all of my heart, I believe that God led me to experience some unpleasant circumstances to prepare me for Caroline. That He led me through those experiences because He was ultimately seeking to accomplish altogether good purposes. That's exactly, I believe, what He was doing in the life of Zacharias and Elizabeth. Having a child in the winter years of life, there couldn't be anything more grueling, more demanding, and in many ways unpleasant. But Zacharias finally is able, through the lens of hindsight, looking back and seeing tangible evidence and proof of God's activity over the past 9 months, to say, you know what, even though He's leading us through this, it's because He is seeking to accomplish good purposes. But there's something else that he was able to discover, something else that you can discover when you recognize, hey, what He's guiding me to experience, what He's burdening me about, it's of Him. The other thing that you recognize and discover is this. You'll have a hint of where God's headed next. You'll have a hint of where God is headed next. Starting in verse 76, Zacharias begins to say some things specifically about this little baby John. And it seems as though, based on what he's saying, he's holding this baby up in his arms, speaking not only to his son, but also to the Lord. And he says to John, "You will be called the prophet of the highest. You will go before the face of the Lord to prepare His ways, to give knowledge of His salvation to people." Now, just 9 months before, he has heard from an angel saying, hey, your wife is going to have this miracle baby. He's skeptical. He's unsure if God is in fact actually in this. But now, 9 months later, he knows this is absolutely the work and the activity of God. God is behind this. And when God finally restores his speech, not only does he communicate that God is accomplishing good purposes, but what he says indicates, I've got a sense of where he's headed next. Now, he doesn't know all of the details. It's as if he's painting a picture with a large brush in broad strokes. All he knows is that this child is going to prepare the way for and lay the foundation for the life, the ministry of the coming Messiah. That he is going to point people to the Messiah and make plain salvation can be found in no one apart from him. Now, there's a lot that he doesn't know. He doesn't know that John the Baptist is going to be kind of a strange bird living out in the desert, eating locusts and wild honey. He doesn't know that. He doesn't know that John is going to one day have his own followers, his own group of disciples. He has no idea that a day is coming when his son John is going to be standing in the Jordan River and Jesus is going to approach and his son is going to baptize the Messiah, the anointed one of God, and He's going to be tangibly, physically present to hear the voice of the Father, the descending of the Spirit in the form of a dove, and having the Son of God before Him in human flesh. He has no idea any of those details, but he does have a sense of where things are headed. Now, what I believe was true for Zacharias is also going to be true for me and for you in our walks with the Lord. When you and I finally discover that God is actually in the burdens that He has placed on our hearts, the thoughts that He's put us on the thoughts He has placed in our minds, the experience He has led us to go through, we not only see that He's accomplishing good purposes, but there's this sense in which we have a hint of where things are headed. Now, we don't know all the ebbs and the flows, the turns to the right and to the left, the ups and the downs of what we're going to experience, but we do have a sense in which things are headed that way. This is the trajectory of where God seems to be going. Now, I'll be honest with you. I wish that I had better news for you. Quite frankly, I wish that I had better news for me, because candidly, I want more than that. Let me paint a picture for you of what I want. Well before the advance in technology that has brought us GPS units and GPS technology on smartphones, if you were going to a city that you've never been to before, you'd have to get a map. Now, you could go to the gas station and buy one and then try to figure out your own route, or you may want to consider joining the AAA Auto Club. Some of you might have done that, and perhaps some of you remember, and you can still get these, but if, let's say you're going to go from Greensboro to Washington, D.C., you're going to take your family on a vacation this summer, and you want to go to D.C., but you've never been there, and so you could call them and say, hey, I need a map. And what AAA will produce is what they call a triptych. And a triptych is a map, but it's about this shape, about that size, and it's spiral bound at the top. And you open the cover, and inside it'll start, you'll see on the map, there's Greensboro. And it'll have maybe the first 15 to 20 miles of the journey, and it'll have that highlighted. When you get to the top of that, you flip the page, and you see the next turns that you're going to take, and they've highlighted all that. In addition, if you look at that page, you can unfold it, and it'll show that area in far greater detail. And they may highlight particular areas of interest. You may want to stop here and see this, the southeast's largest spool of twine, or something like that. They may highlight where particular rest stops or rest areas are, and saying that the next one is going to be 100 miles away. In addition, they would show you that this is a section of 85 that has construction on it, so you can expect some delays. Or on this section of 95, if you're going through Richmond during this time of day, you can expect heavy traffic and expect some delays during that time. If you're traveling in the wintertime, it may say you can expect some icy roads perhaps through this particular section. And they're giving you all of these amazing details before you have even left your driveway. I don't know about you, that's kind of what I want from God. Isn't that what you want? Yeah, I want to know, not only is God in this, not only is He involving me in His work to accomplish something, but I want Him to give me an advanced, detailed triptych of what I'm going to experience. I want to know all the ebbs and the flows. I want to know the slick patches. I want to know where I should encounter a toll road. I want to know where there may be some slick patches in the pavement. I want to know all of that. I wish I could tell you that that's how God works, but the truth is He doesn't work that way. He didn't work that way in Zacharias' life, and He's not going to work that way in yours. The best that you can hope to experience is that when you come to discover God is in this, you'll have a sense of where He is headed next. That's what Zacharias had. Here's the question: why doesn't He give more? Why doesn't He flesh out all the details for us? Very simply, I believe the answer for it is because God is looking for people who will trust the guide, not just who are capable of reading a map. God is looking for people who will trust Him as their guide. He was looking for that in Zacharias' day, and He found it in Zacharias. And when Zacharias finally realized that God was at work, he discovered, man, God is absolutely accomplishing good purposes. Even in what may be, to some extent, for me and my wife, some unpleasant circumstances, He's accomplishing things that are altogether good. And then he was able to see, this is the direction that God is headed. I don't know all the details. I don't know all the ins and outs, but I do know this is where He's headed. And that led him to experience a desire to do what he speaks of in verse 79, to follow the one who guides our feet into the way of peace. So you see that? He's gotten the point. He knows God is in this. God's accomplishing good purposes. This is the direction I believe He's headed. And so my choice now, my decision is that I want to follow the one who will guide my feet to peace. God was looking for that type of person in Zechariah's day, and He found it. God is still looking for that in 2014. The question, very simply for us today, is this: does He find that in you? Won't you bow your heads with me?